this afternoon for the camera. This is Walker Todd. I am the director of the Summer Fellowship Program at AIER, and this is July 18, 2012. We're honored today to have as our guest speaker Professor Lynn Stout from Cornell University Law School. And I'll introduce her in a moment. She'll be generally talking about derivatives. What they are, where they came from, where they seem to be going, and what, if anything, we should do about it. I asked her over lunch, when did she first gain public notice with her articles on derivatives? And it was later than I thought. She said it was after the 2008 crisis. I already knew about her, but I guess it was only the cognoscenti who were aware of her work before then. Turns out we have a few mutual friends. She tells me that she grew up in the general area at Gilderlands in New York in the greater Albany orbit. Went to Princeton as an undergrad and then Yale Law School. And she practiced for a while coming out of Yale. Began teaching eventually at George Washington University, Georgetown, UCLA most recently, and then Cornell for the last 6 months. With that, I will turn it over to Professor Stout.
And thank you so much, Walker, for that kind introduction, and thank you particularly for inviting me to come speak to this group, because you are the people who really count now. I'm going to tell a story. It's a story that it's got a legal part, it's got a historical part, it's got an economic part, it's got a politics part. It's a story I've been telling actually in ever-increasing detail for coming up on 17 years now. What I find is that if you are over the age of 50 and you do not already know this story, you will never understand it, ever. It is amazing. So I am not interested in talking to those people over 50 who still don't understand the story. I can assure you that Walker knows it very well.
Right. That means that Larry and Frank can leave, right? But
yeah. I'm interested in talking to those of you who are getting started in your careers and are capable, as it were, of understanding what I think is actually a really straightforward and in some ways absolutely obvious thing. As obvious as the nakedness of the proverbial emperor once it was pointed out. All right, so we'll start off with derivatives. And we're going to start off by talking about what they are and the investment world, which, by the way, I'm also part of. I sit on the board of directors of the Eaton Vance family of mutual funds, and so I routinely deal with portfolio managers and investment managers. And when they talk about derivatives, they will talk about them as investments or contracts or assets, sometimes toxic assets, or leverage. All of these vague nouns miss the essence of derivatives. What they are literally is wagers. There is no better word in the English language to more accurately capture what derivatives are than wagers. Because a derivative is nothing more than an agreement between two people that one party to the agreement will pay money to the other party to the agreement depending on whether or not something happens in the future. And so when you go to the racetrack and you put $2 down on I'll have another, you have just bought what we might call, an I'll have another victory option. When you wager on the Super Bowl, you're entering a Super Bowl swap. That's what a Wall Street trader would call it. And when they enter interest rate swaps and credit default swaps and all of these various things that fall under the rubric of derivatives, we need to understand that they are literally placing wagers on the directions of interest rates, credit ratings, equity prices, currency exchange rates, all sorts of phenomena, but they're ultimately wagers. Now, it turns out that there's a long history of wagering. I believe there's something about the Romans throwing dice for Jesus's robe, right? Have I got that story right? It actually goes back considerably before that. And Aristotle, in his Politics, describes one of the earliest written descriptions of a derivative contract entered by the philosopher Thales, who essentially entered a futures contract on an olive oil press in the expectation that there would be a bumper olive oil crop and therefore great demand for olive oil presses. So the notion that you can bet on market phenomena just as you bet on horse races or chariot races or rolls of the dice or anything else is hardly new. And in fact, in the United States in the 19th century, there was a very well-developed form of derivative contract that was called, very close, it was called a difference contract. And the idea was that you would bet on the prices of commodities, wheat, corn, cattle, and you would look to some period in the future, and one party would pay the other the difference between the wager price and the actual market price at the time period in the future that the parties had selected, which was why it was called a difference contract. And it was nothing more than a derivative. So one of the first things we need to realize is that we've had really well-developed derivatives markets for a long time. An interesting part to that historical story is the legal part. Just as we've had derivatives regulation for a really long time. And derivatives regulation for most of the common law history was based exactly on wagering regulation. So I love to go back to the Romans. The Romans were, of course, incredibly clever and in their own way, modern minds that we can understand. And so they did a couple of interesting things. One thing they did was they made wagering legal only for 2 weeks of the year during the festival of Saturnalia, because they understood the importance of allowing people to release their animal spirits periodically. But the other thing they did was they said that even when wagering is legal, wagering debts are not legally enforceable. You can't go into court and expect the state to invest resources in enforcing a gambling debt. And this actually meant that when Romans wanted to gamble, and gamble they did, they had to go to private gambling clubs. And Roman gambling clubs did exactly what gambling clubs do today, including casinos and racetracks. If you're going to place a bet, the first thing you have to do? Buy chips. You have to actually show the casino that you have the money that you could possibly lose when you walk in the door. Well, it turned out something like that developed in the 19th century for difference contracts, wagers on market phenomena. The rule in the United States, and there's a great, you can find it in an 1868 U.S. Supreme Court case, Irwin versus Willie R. And it says the rule in this country is that when people are wagering on prices, that is not legally enforceable. You can wager, but don't expect public resources to go into the enforcement of your gambling contract. And as a result, people who wanted to wager on markets set up their own private gambling clubs, just as the Romans did. And we call these private gambling clubs the Commodities Futures Exchanges. And that is the origin of the future exchange. Of course, there have been markets, physical exchanges, where people met to exchange goods for thousands of years. But what happened at the futures exchanges was that people met to gamble on goods. And as a result, and for example, one of the ways they would do it is instead of actually trading wheat, you would trade what were called elevator receipts. You would say, well, I'm going to give you a piece of paper that at least in theory entitles you to go get 100 bushels of wheat out of an elevator somewhere. But the wheat never actually left the elevator. People just speculated on the value of the elevator receipt. Eventually, they began speculating in what are called forward contracts, promises to deliver wheat in the future. But of course, there was no expectation you would actually deliver the wheat. So they became called futures contracts with no expectation of delivery. And these were examples of the sort of fundamental wagers on agricultural commodity products that were routinely traded in the futures exchanges, with very little negative consequences for the public because the futures exchanges, like casinos and Roman gambling clubs, had enough sense to make sure that the people who went there to gamble could pay their debts. And so you couldn't just walk into a future exchange. You had to place your bet through a member of the exchange who guaranteed your performance. And the exchanges ran clearing houses, and all of the trades that were netted up on the clearing houses were collectively guaranteed to be performed by the exchange members, which meant that if you wanted to be a member of the exchange, and of course remember you had to gamble or to place bets on behalf of other gamblers, you had to meet the exchange membership requirements, which included minimum capital requirements, posting margin requirements, and also because you were personally obligated to perform the bets that you placed for other people, you made sure that the clients for whom you were acting as a broker could also make good on their bets, very often by collecting the amount of the potential losses of the bet up front. And so this system worked like a charm, and it kept derivatives from causing any trouble until the early 1990s. Now I'm going to back off and talk about the economic piece just a little bit, the economic piece of the story, and talk about why the law casts such a jaundiced eye on pure wagering, to the point where it wouldn't enforce pure wagers, and indeed you had to create these private gambling clubs to enforce them. And the reason is the law turns out to be very economically sophisticated, more sophisticated than many people who take economics courses, especially if they took economics courses in the latter part of the 20th century. And the reason why the law didn't want to enforce wagers was that wagering was associated with a number of economic problems. Now, you will find some early cases that talk about gambling having tainted morals, and you'll have some moralistic language. But if you read past that, you'll see that courts are concerned about very specific economic problems. One of them, interestingly enough, was that they viewed gambling as non-productive. And they said the ability to wager on prices discouraged the disposition to engage in steady labor. Another economic concern that they voiced was that it added to systemic risk. Now, of course, they didn't use the word systemic risk, but what they said was allowing wagering encourages people to make bets beyond their means, leading to bankruptcies that bring down the bona fide dealer in the wake of the speculator. So, beautiful description of systemic risk, 150 years before anyone in Washington, D.C. ever got around to talking about it. Now, how can this be possible? It's possible because common law courts recognized a concept that disappeared from most economics curricula in the latter part of the 20th century, and that is the concept of uncertainty. How many of you have read The Black Swan? Okay. It's actually a pretty good book. I approached it with a very jaundiced eye, thinking anything that made the New York Times bestseller list was probably not going to be all that great. It's in fact really good. And one of the things that Nassim Taleb does is he sort of, in a very dramatic and provocative way, tries to make us remember what Keynes taught us, which is that we are always subject to the dark forces of time and ignorance. Meaning, when we forecast into the future, there will be lots of things where we not only don't know what's going to happen, we don't even know the possible probabilities of what might happen. And this is a concept, and I took a whole bunch of economics courses. I have an undergraduate degree and a master's degree from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, and it was very heavily oriented toward economic analysis. And we spent endless amounts of time in statistics talking about risk, which is probabilistic variation in the future. We never talked about uncertainty. We acted as if we actually knew what the probabilities were, that interest rates would go up or interest rates would go down, or that China would become a global powerhouse, or that a pandemic would sweep the planet. We just assumed that someone somewhere knew that that was 20% probable or 30% probable, because if you assumed that, you could do all sorts of wonderful things with formula and come up with all sorts of certain answers. But as Keynes points out, that's mere risk. Probabilistic variation in the future is risk. But variation in the future that can't be captured by probabilities because we don't know what they are is uncertainty. And uncertainty turns out to be a fascinating economic concept, at least to me, that upends all sorts of common ideas that were taught as conventional wisdom in economics classes in the latter part of the 20th century, and also carries some really interesting policy implications. And one of the most fascinating policy implications to me is that when people don't know the future, they can disagree about the future. And when people disagree about the future, they will be tempted to do what I call speculate on disagreement. So this is what I mean quite simply. You may think that the probability of the dollar doubling in value relative to the euro is 80%. If I shared your probability estimate and also thought the probability of the euro doubling against the dollar was 80%, neither of us would think we could make money from betting with each other on what was going to happen to the euro. But suppose that one of us actually thinks that the euro is going to lose value relative to the dollar. Now, we look at each other and we say, oh, you know what? This person is an idiot and doesn't predict the future as well as I do. I can make money by betting with them. And of course, this is exactly what goes on in stock markets all day long. If I buy General Motors because I think it's going to go up and you sell it because you think it's going to go down, that is what I am defining as speculation. And what's interesting about it is that, number one, it isn't possible in the absence of uncertainty and subjective disagreement. If we both agreed on the probability of General Motors going up and down, we might trade for liquidity or other reasons, but we're not going to trade in the hope of making trading profits at the other person's expense. But the reality is, actually, anyone who studies stock markets can assure you that goes on all the time. In fact, the phenomenon of trying to profit from trading on disagreement pretty much explains the entire industry of actively traded mutual funds. So we've got a world in which it's clear that people do disagree about the future, and they do try and profit from their disagreement. And what are the consequences of that? Well, here's the problem. When we trade with each other because we disagree on what's going to happen to the future, one of us is by definition going to be wrong. This is not Adam Smith's mutually beneficial exchange, where the butcher and the baker exchange bread and meat and they both end up happier at the end of the day. This is a voluntary transaction that nevertheless does not promote social welfare. And indeed, to the extent that there are transactions costs involved, it actually reduces the average welfare of the trading parties. And this is what the courts were saying when they were describing speculation in derivatives as discouraging the disposition to engage in steady labor. It was their way of recognizing that when you have a large body of your population that's trying to profit by trading on disagreement, they are collectively going to fail, and in the meantime, they will have wasted their efforts, incurred transactions costs, and reduced overall social wealth. The other interesting thing that happens when people speculate on disagreement, however, is that they accept risk because they expect to be paid for it, when in fact, on average, they cannot be paid for it. So if I trade in my $100 for a share of General Motors stock, I am trading in a relatively certain asset for a riskier asset, and I'm doing that because I expect that my risky asset will increase in value, generating a positive return that will compensate me for the risk that I have created and taken on. The problem is, we know ex post that on average, people who do this are mistaken. So when I first started talking about this phenomenon, actually, it wasn't in the context of derivatives, it was in the context of stock markets. And I actually wrote an article in I can't remember, it was like I think it was late 1980s, early 1990s. Yeah. The title was, Are Stock Markets Costly Casinos? And what I said is, we've gone from a world where the average holding period for a share of stock is 8 years. At that point, it was under a year. Do we really need to trade every share of stock on the New York Stock Exchange every year? Or in fact, is this wasteful trading that is eroding social wealth by having people incur transactions costs and possibly increasing risk at the time? And what I ran into there are these standard economist defense, which come right from Milton Friedman, or more accurately, a misreading of Milton Friedman, that says, oh, well, it doesn't matter if stock trading doesn't on average generate net returns for the sellers and buyers. It produces indirect social benefits in the form of greater liquidity and so-called price discovery. And so I finally went back and read old Uncle Milt, and I realized Uncle Milt, when he was talking about speculation, basically explicitly says, in a kind of odd way, but it's right there in defense of price destabilizing speculation, he basically assumes away uncertainty, and he's very explicit about it. He says, I am assuming that if someone buys a commodity because they think the price is going to go up, they are right. In other words, they have information that allows them to understand true probabilities where the other person is mistaken. And I think that we should not describe that as speculation. We should describe that as information arbitrage. And it is true that in a world, even in a certain world where we know what all the probabilities are, because they're positive cost information, there will be some people who will know the true probabilities and other people who don't want to invest the money in finding out. And in that world, you can have information arbitrageurs who do in fact consistently profit from trading on the superior information that they're willing to pay for that the rest of us aren't. The problem is, I can assure you that's not what's going on in stock markets most of the time, because one of the predictions of Milton Friedman's arbitrage theory, or information arbitrage theory, is that speculators should over time make money. And let me remind you of the endless studies we've done that actively managed mutual funds on average underperform the market. So they are not making money. We have got a stock market dominated by disagreement-based trading. And as for liquidity, the argument is, yeah, obviously we need some liquidity, and it's nice that we have some people who are mistakenly buying and selling thinking they can predict an uncertain future. But has anyone ever stopped to calculate whether the social benefits of that additional liquidity are in fact greater than the social costs of all those wasted transactions costs and all that newly created risk? And I will tell you, no one has made that calculation. I myself have doubts, especially now that the stock market has got an average holding period of 4 months. So the entire stock market is now changing hands every 4 months. I think we've got a tad more liquidity than we really need. But when you take that analysis and you put it onto derivatives markets, what you see is that all of these problems are moved up to an entire order of magnitude. The nice thing about stock markets is that your ability to take on new risk by buying and selling stocks is limited by your wealth and by securities exchange rules that limit your ability to borrow to buy stocks to only 50%. It turns out in derivatives markets, in the absence of those nice private gambling clubs to keep everybody in line, it could be possible in theory for people to take on infinite risk by making infinite bets. And, yeah.
I'm confused on two things.
Yeah.
The concept of margin is going to come in before we get to infinity, I think. And I'm a little confused by the definition of speculation. Suppose that I'm a farmer and I want to hedge my corn crop, and you take the other side of that.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to pay you a little bit for the liquidity, the hedge, whatever.
Yeah.
Does that make you a speculator or are you something else?
Thank you for asking that question. I can't believe I missed that. I can't believe you let me get this far without mentioning that. All right. Guess what? No, you're not a speculator.
Not a speculator.
You are an insurer.
Oh, we had this one at lunch.
Right, but no, but the other people haven't followed along. There is, I've been operating under the assumption that wagers are being driven by disagreement over the future, as indeed most of them are in casinos and roaming gambling clubs, and I believe in the derivatives market. But there is a kind of wager that's made frequently for very different reasons, and it's wagers that would be made between people who agree on future probabilities. It's wagering that does not require subjective disagreement, and we call it insurance. When you buy insurance, you are making a bet. If you buy homeowners insurance, you are betting with the insurance company that your house will burn down. If the house burns down, you win the bet. But you've lost the house. And the point of wagers that are used for insurance is that they actually shift risk from a party for whom it is more costly to someone to whom it is cheaper to bear the risk. So in the case of homeowners insurance, What you're doing is you've got an insurance company that can diversify away some of the risk by pooling the risk of all of these houses that might burn down. Whereas if each individual homeowner couldn't buy homeowners insurance, they would have to bear the risk themselves. And you can have that kind of Adam Smith market where both the insured and the insurer feel better ex ante and ex post as a result of having purchased the insurance. And that market does not require disagreement. Even if the insurance company and I both agree that the odds of my house burning down are 0.5%, I will still want to buy insurance, and they, if they can diversify and make a decent profit, will still want to sell it. And another version of that is sometimes you can actually eliminate risk when you can find people who are subject to opposing risks. And this is the classic example of the farmer who's worried about the risk that wheat prices will go down, and the cereal manufacturer who's worried about the risk that wheat prices will go up. Well, if you can put those two together, that really is market magic. You actually can make that risk disappear. And the law has recognized this for a long time. There has been wagering for a long time, and generally wagers are not unenforceable, but there was an old common law exception to the rule against difference contracts that said, oh, by the way, if one of the parties to the difference contract can prove that they are actually exposed to a pre-existing economic risk, and this wager reduces their risk, we're going to make it legally enforceable, and we're going to call it a kind of insurance. So what the law did and I believe this is true in England for at least 300 years. It's true in the United States for as long as there has been in the United States. The law made this careful distinction. They say generally wagers are not legally enforceable. If you want them to be enforced, you have to go to a private gambling club that will use private ordering to make them enforceable. But there is one exception. If you can prove this was a true insurance contract, now we believe it's a mutually beneficial social transaction that, if anything, reduces risk. Now we are willing to subsidize it by giving you access to public courts to enforce it. So this was part of the problem, is that when people talk about speculation in economics classes, which, by the way, they do shockingly seldom. I actually had a research assistant go dredge out all of these Econ 101 and basic finance texts, and I said, I want you to go to the index, look for an entry for speculation, and look for an entry for uncertainty. And damn it, but he didn't find them. I mean, it was just shocking how can an Econ 101 text, much less a corporate finance text, not have an entry for speculation or uncertainty, but most of them don't, which is a sign of just how much this contract dropped out of sight culturally in the academy. So anyway, so once you understand what Milton Friedman was really talking about, which is information arbitrage, where in fact the future is not certain but is known, or the probabilities are known, and we're simply talking about someone who's invested in information that allows him to discover the probabilities and is essentially providing liquidity at a price to people who are too lazy or too cheap to go get that information themselves. And once you understand that hedging certainly is possible, but it is also very possible to have apparently speculative trading that is not in fact hedging, and there's reason to suspect that that is in fact the majority of the trading that's going on financial markets. Now we're back in that world that the common law recognized for so long, where rampant gambling on future prices erodes returns, discourages productive activity, and increases risks. And that was the world that the common law took care of so neatly. So what the heck happened to the common law? Well, what happened was what usually happens to the common law, which is that it gets turned into a statute. It gets codified, as we lawyers say. And this happens first at the state level with what were called anti-bucket shop laws that made gambling on stock prices affirmatively illegal. And then we get the creation of the Federal Commodities Exchange Act, which first starts off as the Futures Trading Act of 1926 or something. It's actually pre-crash.
Right. It's around 26. Yeah.
Right. That gets changed into the Commodities Exchange Act of 1936, which then gets reenacted in various forms. But what the codification did, in a way, was simply make statutory the division that had already developed between gambling on futures exchanges, where it was permissible and regulated by the futures exchange members, and gambling off of the exchanges in the so-called over-the-counter market, where wagering was only enforceable if it was insurance. And we had this really nice, neat division that worked beautifully up until we get to 1980s. And you know what happens in 1986? Anybody here who's British? Well, good thing, because it's all their fault. What happens in 1986 is that the Brits pass a statute called, I think, the Financial Modernization Act of 1986. I love the way everything you do that's a disaster is called modernization, right? We're going to see this pattern over and over again. And what the 1986 British Act did was overrule another 300-year-old statute called, I believe, the Statute of Anne, and said, guess what? We're announcing that as long as you're betting on interest rates and currency exchange ratios and market phenomenon, now your wagers are legally enforceable in the City of London, which, by the way, suddenly found itself a very popular destination for all sorts of people who wanted to gamble. A little bit like the Macau or the Las Vegas of the financial gambling world. Well, once the Brits had this really nice little gambling business going, as you can imagine, Wall Street goes to Congress and says, well, we want to be able to have gambling on market phenomenon here in the United States too. And they first go to the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, which is the agency that's charged with enforcing the Commodities Exchange Act, which for so many decades had said, gambling on a futures exchange, okay. Gambling off a future exchange, sorry, you can't do it. And at that time, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission was headed by an economist named Wendy Graham, who just happens to be the wife of Texas Senator Phil Graham, and never saw a market transaction she didn't like. And her view was, oh, hey, if the Brits are doing it, this is great. We're going to create an exemption. We're going to say, we're going to allow off-exchange wagering on interest rates, so-called interest rate swaps, and we're going to allow off-exchange, I'm simplifying the story a little bit, but Congress put in place as well an exemption for off-exchange gambling on foreign exchange rates. So these exemptions show up in the mid-1980s. And what happens almost immediately, actually, foreign exchanges in the mid-1980s, I think interest rate swaps are in the early 90s. Almost immediately, we, number one, get, well, Barings Bank goes bankrupt, betting on interest rate swaps. Procter & Gamble loses a couple $100 million gambling on interest rate swaps. Orange County's pension plan goes bankrupt, gambling on interest rate swaps. And then in 1998, we get the failure of a little hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management. I exaggerate when I say it's little. It was so large that there was actually an emergency meeting orchestrated by the Federal Reserve where all the banks were brought in and their heads were knocked together and they were told, if you do not bail out long-term capital management, the entire system may collapse. You guys better take care of this. So we have a very clear, obvious object lesson, right? In what happens when you change a legal rule that dates back at least 300 years, maybe 3,000 if we count the Roman gambling laws. Answer, nothing good, right? And at that point, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission is headed by a sort of very calm, methodical, analytical lawyer named Brooks Liborn, who does the sensible thing, looks at all this and says, you know what? I think we ought to look into whether or not the Commodities Futures Trading Commission ought to extend some sort of regulatory reach over gambling in financial derivatives off of an exchange. Seems reasonable, right? Well, not if you're Alan Greenspan or Larry Summers or Paul Rubin, all of whom are members.
Robert Rubin.
Robert Rubin, my mistake. Getting my Rubins mixed up. Don't even get me on the diamonds and the diamonds. And the Paulsons and the Paulsons. Robert Rubin and Larry and Alan are all members of something called the President's Working Group. So is Brooks Liborn. They basically get together, they go to President Clinton, and they say, she's going to single-handedly destroy financial innovation. These markets are absolutely essential to future economic growth. Liquidity is always good. Trading is always good. Financial innovation is always good. How can Brooks Liborn not understand this? She's an idiot. I'm translating somewhat. She needs to be gotten rid of. And she was indeed gotten rid of. And then the US Congress says, you know what, we're so pleased with the way this early experiment in legalizing interest rate swaps worked out. we are going to pass a statute called the Commodities Futures Modernization Act of 2000. I love this. If they made murder legal, they would call it the Homicide Modernization Act. We're going to pass the Commodities Futures Trading Modernization Act, which was, oh, by the way, and I forgot to mention, was backed by Texas Senator Phil Gramm. And where was his wife? Oh yeah, she was no longer the head of the CFTC. That was Brooksley Bourne. Now Wendy Graham is on the board of directors of, Enron, which wants to do, yes, speculation and energy derivatives. And so Phil Gramm passes with Bill Clinton's full support. Boy, this was an equal opportunity policy disaster. The Commodities Futures Modernization Act, which announces for the first time in American legal history, gambling off of exchanges is legalized. The first victim, ironically and appropriately enough, is Enron, which as a result of the legalization of energy derivatives goes bust. Not from fraud, it went bust from bad energy bets. The fraud was to cover up the fact that it had gone bust from bad energy bets. Then, of course, we get in rapid succession in 2008, we get the failures of Lehman Brothers. Bear actually was not so much in derivatives. They were mostly actually mortgage-backed bonds, but Lehman was very heavily in derivatives. And the real kicker was AIG, which had basically been allowed to take bets without buying its chips first, and had taken on something like $47 trillion in bets on credit ratings against various counterparties that it could not possibly have paid off because it didn't have 47 trillion. And who were the counterparties? Among others, Goldman Sachs. So everybody talks about the AIG bailout. It was not an AIG bailout. It was actually a Goldman Sachs bailout. The reason why AIG got all that money was so that Goldman Sachs could get its bets paid off, because Goldman Sachs had other bets that it had lost on, and if it didn't get paid off for its winning bets, Goldman Sachs would have gone under. So we get the financial crisis, and what do you think would happen then? Well, the first thing is, by the way, how many people know this story? Seriously, have you heard this story? Okay, that's good. So it's at least one of the people over the age of 50 has already heard this story. And the rest of you have not even heard this story, have you? Which is in itself an interesting and it's been told somewhere, but the media has not done a good job. It's told in bits and pieces of the media, but the media has not done a good job of telling the entire story. But not surprisingly, what you get is there actually is a provision in Dodd-Frank that is designed to address the problem of purely speculative, return-eroding, risk-creating gambling in financial derivatives. It's called Title VII. And what it attempts to do is to, in a way, go back to the old codified law and the old common law, where all derivatives have to be traded on what's called a clearing organization, so that the members of the clearing organization guarantee the trades. So it's designed to be a regulatory solution that ensures that you can't ever again get an AIG or someone who's making bets that they can't actually afford to make, so that if the market moves against them, they will suddenly find themselves insolvent, potentially triggering the insolvency of other related institutions. Unfortunately, the problem is that Title VII of Dodd-Frank leaves an enormous amount of discretion over the extent to which this clearing rule will apply and who gets to provide clearing services and what the requirements are for an organization to provide clearing services and which sorts of derivatives, which are now called swaps. I mean, they've called difference contracts, derivatives, swaps, doesn't matter, they're all wagers. But the question of which categories of swaps will be subject to the clearing requirement is all left to the to the discretion of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, which is this little tiny commission with a really restricted budget. And what is essentially going on right now is that every time the CFTC tries to make a rule or hold a hearing, the financial industry is paying accountants and lawyers and lobbyists $800 an hour to literally go fill the room. At all of these hearings and roundtables, the industry is literally stacking the room with bodies that are paid on an hourly basis to try and make sure that the Commodities Futures Trading Commission does not, in fact, impose any limits that will keep them from gambling in the future. So have I talked enough? I think I've talked more than enough. How long have I been going?
Go ahead and talk a little longer. I gotta get this thing fixed.
Okay, then I'll talk a little bit longer. Okay, so, and this is why, okay, now I'm going to get to why I'm so depressed. By the way, the good news is I wrote a series of articles in the 1990s, which Walker was kind enough to reference, where I basically said, this is what derivatives are, this is what they do, this is what the common law says about them, don't deregulate them, don't deregulate them, Brooksley Born is right, don't do this, if you do this, bad things will happen. And apart from Walker and maybe two other people, no one read these articles. Although I can tell you, I actually know that Brooksley Born read them. And look what happened to her. After 2008, these articles suddenly experienced a renaissance. It's amazing. I would say their readership has gone up by several orders of magnitude today. But it's still depressing because what we're really dealing with here is now we're going to get to the political problem. It's the political problem that societies face in dealing with economic externalities that are generated by uncertainty as opposed to risk. And the reason is that some kinds of economically destructive activities driven by uncertainty simply cannot be dealt with by democratic institution because the same uncertainty that drives the economically destructive activity makes it incapable of having an intelligent political response. And I'll now try and make that more concrete. This is the problem we face in regulating speculation generally and speculative trading and gambling and derivatives in particular. When the market is first legalized, indeed you can say subsidized, if you think you can make money by betting on the future, you don't want anybody to stop you from doing that. You don't want any regulation. If you're more modest about your abilities to make predictions, you still don't want regulation because you don't need it. You say, I don't need to be protected from losing all my money on the racetrack. I don't think I'm a good horse picker anyway. I'm not going to the racetrack. So the people who think they're going to be bad at speculation don't demand regulation because they figure they're not going to engage in it. And the people who think they're going to profit from speculation don't want regulation because they think they're going to profit from it. Well, inevitably, half of the people who think they're going to profit from disagreement-based speculation are going to be wrong. But even after they've suffered losses, they still don't want regulation. Why? Well, first of all, there's the humiliating, problem of having to admit you were a loser and you shot yourself in the foot. But quite apart from that, in a way, we're back in the same position. What you say is, okay, I lost my shirt in derivatives, but I don't need regulation because I'm just not going to speculate in derivatives anymore. Oh, but by the way, I might think I'm actually really good at commodities prices and gold, so now I'm going to start speculating in oil and gold. Yeah. So what we have a constant problem, that same uncertainty, those same dark forces of time and ignorance that drive people into risk-creating, return-reducing speculation also impede the ability of any democratic political organization to respond to that problem because there is no democratic or popular support for reining it in. To rein in economically destructive speculation, you need something other than democracy. And it's very interesting to me, if you look at the history of derivatives regulation, it is non-democratic governing institutions that seem to be able to do it. Remember those Roman gambling clubs? Well, I guess you could say the Roman Senate was kind of democratic, but only in a very narrow sense. The common law rule was developed by judges, the least democratic of our governing institutions. The CFTC, while it worked, is an independent agency that is subject to a number of insulations that are designed to keep it from being subject to voter pressures. These broke down, by the way, in the 1980s and 1990s because Congress figured out it could use the power of the purse. It couldn't tell the CFTC what to do, but it could starve its resources, and it could exercise political influence over who got appointed to head it.
Right.
So okay, now I am ready to finish up, right?
Okay.
So this is the political part of the story. The history is clear. The law is clear. I think the economics, once we understand that there was economics before there was Milton and Friedman, and once we understand that it's a mistake for modern texts not to have an entry for uncertainty and for speculation, the economics are pretty clear. And the problem is the political economy is also pretty clear and very problematic. So thank you. Thank you for your
thank you.
patience.